From the moment I chose this career, I knew I would encounter situations that would test my mind, temperament, and sanity, but I never imagined I would experience something as upsetting as what happened to me a few years ago. Even now, whenever I close my eyes and think back on those details, a chill goes down the back of my neck. I work as a forensic doctor at an old hospital in the United States, a place where the corridors seem to stretch the shadows in the dimness of night, and where silence can occasionally feel overwhelming. I can't say that I ever completely adapted to the constant presence of cold, lifeless bodies, but the surroundings had become comfortable after working there for a few months. There were always rumors of strange happenings in the hospital, but no one took them seriously. In the end, we usually put the whispered voices or sudden thumps down to the normal sounds of an aging building that sees a lot of life and death. However, every corner of the basement where the morgue is located has its own echo of tragic stories, some more horrific than others. But my colleagues and I generally kept our composure. Around 9:00 p.m. that evening, we were presented with a case that deeply affected me due to its nature and the anguish I saw on the faces of the OBGYN physicians. They brought in a young patient who was nearly at full term in her pregnancy, experiencing severe complications and losing consciousness in the operating room. Sadly, the baby, a boy, did not survive, and I was left to handle his tiny body. I started my work as professionally as I could, but the scene was shocking. Something in the air, a weight pressing on my chest, made it difficult to focus. I placed the small body on a specially designed stainless steel tray, which is similar to the little metal cradle we always use for deceased newborns. This was a temporary procedure before the family, if they wished, could see and say goodbye to the baby in case the mother regained consciousness and decided to do so. Seeing his tiny motionless limbs gave me a lump in my throat that I tried to hide because I had to remain composed and not allow my emotions to take over. It would give her that final moment. That day, I had to complete the standard preliminary forensic procedures, fill out forms, sign papers, label the body as needed, and feel a dull ache inside while thinking about the mother, who I had been told was still unconscious. The ICU staff was doing everything they could to stabilize her, and there was a tense sense of uncertainty throughout the hospital. The order was to keep the baby's body in cold storage, but first I had to complete the common preliminary forensic procedures. Your mind creates a sort of defense mechanism when you witness death frequently, particularly the deaths of newborns. The atmosphere felt unbearably heavy, so I clung to logic and science, weight, height, and external appearance as potential causes. I also began to hear strange noises in the morgue, like soft tapping, which I initially attributed to the ventilation system or the pipes. Sometimes you hear metallic creaks, which are caused by temperature changes inside the cold chambers, so I dismissed it as normal. As I worked, a colleague assisted me in moving the small metal cradle into a nearby room so that I could get ready for the autopsy. This was a routine procedure, but it was extremely painful to perform on such a fragile body. As the night wore on, the hospital became even more silent, with only the emergency lights remaining on in the hallways and the faint sound of machines and the occasional security guard's footsteps. Shortly after midnight, I became extremely tired and made the decision to take a quick break. I switched off the main room's lights, leaving only the emergency lamp's faint glow. The walls were eerily covered in shadows. A few minutes later, I heard a distant cry that was hardly audible at first, and my mind was confused, wondering if it was the TV in the on-call lounge. I was sitting at my desk going over some documents when I felt a sudden chill and the distinct impression that someone else was breathing in the room. I looked around and saw no one, but the feeling persisted. The sound appeared to be coming from somewhere down here in the basement, possibly a nearby hallway, but it could have been a visitor sobbing on the floor above. The crying continued, stretching into a brief, heartbreaking wail that sounded like something coming from a very small creature. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but after working long shifts, fatigue can trick you into hearing things that aren't there. As I paid closer attention, I realized it clearly resembled a baby crying. My heart began to race. The crying stopped as soon as I crossed the threshold of the adjacent room where the small metal cradle was. The room appeared to be the same as before, but I noticed something. The metal cradle was rocking gently. It was barely noticeable, but it was enough to make every hair on my body stand on end. The door to the cold chamber, where I should have already placed the baby, was still closed, and no one else had entered. I could feel my breathing. My legs felt leaden, and my mouth quickly dried up. With extreme caution, I opened the cold chamber and saw the baby's body lying there, motionless and covered by the tiny white sheet we always use for newborns. I crept closer, trying to maintain control, and looked for any explanation for that slight swaying. My mind frantically tried to come up with a rational explanation, like a slight tremor in the building or some vibration, but there had been no reports of any tremor, and everything else in the room was perfectly still. I tried to ignore the pulse in my throat as I closed the chamber and went back to my desk to continue working. The constant sense that I was being watched by unseen eyes. About an hour later, as I was going through more documents, I had a feeling that something more than random was at work here, even though I kept telling myself that there was nothing to be afraid of because in a place like this, any little sound or unexpected movement could make us uneasy. When I heard a metallic clatter, as if something had fallen onto the slab, I jumped up and tried to calm myself before going outside to the hallway, which was deserted and had flickering lights that seemed to indicate an electrical issue. I had the sudden urge to check the next room again, and when I did, the temperature was even colder than usual, but the doors to the refrigeration units were still closed. Then, the silence was broken by a faint SOB sounding closer this time, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I was certain that this came from inside the chamber where the baby was kept, but I approached and opened the door with trembling hands. The baby's body was exactly as I had left it, but my ears were not playing tricks on me. The crying was clear, a muffled whimper that made my skin crawl. Even though I knew it was impossible, I reached in to touch the sheet and felt the body's freezing cold, motionless pulse, but the sobbing continued. My mind raced for a scientific explanation, possibly stress-induced auditory hallucinations or sound traveling from another area of the hospital, but the Morgue's isolation made such a possibility a possibility. Panic made me recoil, so I closed the chamber and staggered back, staring at the polished metal that contained the child. Unlikely, a gloomy fear warped my reasoning, implying that something supernatural was taking place here. Suddenly, there was a wave of nausea and the atmosphere in the room felt heavy, as if the air itself had density. My head started to pound, and I had a rose in my throat. I felt someone behind me as I pressed myself up against the wall and became aware that my limbs were trembling. My neck pricked, and every part of my body felt cold. I spun around so fast that I almost tripped, and I thought I saw a shadow moving close to the metal cradle out of the corner of my eye. It wasn't a distinct shape, but rather a dark blur, as though the darkness had formed briefly before vanishing. The fear that overcame me was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. It was a raw terror that told me to flee and never return, but my sense of duty and professional pride kept me there. I took a shaky breath and made my way back to the cradle, which was still cold to the touch and motionless, having only been swaying. But I could feel something odd in the room, like a residual magnetism, and my heart was racing as if it might explode. I tried to say something comforting, but I felt foolish because I was speaking into emptiness, and my mind kept going back to the mother, who was lying unconscious and unable to say goodbye. I wanted to tell him about the cries I heard, but I was afraid he would laugh at me or wouldn't believe it. His presence didn't completely calm me either because of the oppressive atmosphere. Ed read the file, and at one point we both fell silent. Suddenly, there was a faint echoing sound in the room, and my colleague looked up in alarm. I saw the disquiet in his eyes, which confirmed it wasn't my imagination. He got up quickly and went for the main morgue door, but to my surprise, he froze in place, staring at the cradle. I was shocked to see that it was rocking once more as I drew nearer. This time, the movement was more obvious than before, and neither of us dared to touch it. We stood there, breathing unevenly, paralyzed, and unsure of what to do. The faint squeak of the metal and the barely audible crying created a truly terrifying atmosphere, and I thought that anything could suddenly attack us. The darkness in the corners seemed to come to life, and my colleague's face showed complete disbelief as he kept shaking his head, as if to convince himself it wasn't real. I took a few steps with the intention of stopping the cradle from moving, but just before my fingers touched the metal, a loud bang came from inside the cold chamber, like someone knocked the door. I needed courage to open the door, and my colleague wouldn't come near inside. I knew exactly how I had placed the baby inside, and according to medical science, there was no chance anything inside could bang on the door that way, much less with such force. I left the baby's body in the same position, but the blanket was slightly pulled back as if someone had moved it from within. My first instinct was to check for vital signs, knowing full well that this was a dead infant as expected. No pulse was present. The skin had a marble-cold temperature. I took off the blanket to check for any injuries or changes since the first report, but I noticed nothing out of the ordinary. Then, my colleague whispered my name in a hoarse, terrified voice, and I looked up to see him pointing to the hallway. I didn't have to look very far to see a blurry figure hurrying past at the far end of the corridor, almost as if it were floating. It was so fast that it was almost impossible to see, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. In an attempt to prevent myself from collapsing, my colleague chased after that shadow out of some irrational reflex. I stayed there by myself with the baby's body, and the cradle's silence encircled the room once more. But a tingling sensation on my skin let me know that I wasn't alone. A strange grief overcame me, and I suddenly came to believe that the swaying cradle and the spectral presence that was crying were caused by a broken bond between mother and child, as if the baby was seeking a last act of love that never occurred. Overwhelmed by sorrow, I started whispering softly, as though the infant could hear me, and I did something strange. Something changed in the room. A wave of icy air swept past, and I felt as though the atmosphere lightened slightly. I apologized, acknowledged his loss, understood his confusion, and meant no harm. I'm not sure why I did this, perhaps to relieve the tension that was eating at me. At least for a brief moment, the crying stopped. I carefully closed the chamber and put my hand on the door as a sign of respect and goodbye, and then my colleague came back. His face was pale as he told me that he saw no one in the hallway and that the person he was chasing appeared to vanish into the darkness. He looked at me in fear, expecting an explanation, but I was unable to give it because my throat was so tight that I could hardly speak. We checked to see if anyone had entered the building without permission, but there was no evidence of that. Security cameras were few in that area of the building, and anyway, no human moves that quickly or in that gliding way. We both decided to complete the paperwork as soon as possible and turn over the baby's body to the appropriate department so the family could take him whenever they were ready. So we stayed together for the night. When morning arrived, a nurse told us that the mother was still on a ventilator but had partially regained consciousness. She was unable to speak, but she opened her eyes and appeared restless, as if she sensed the absence of her baby even through the sedation. The image of that cradle moving, the horrifying sound of crying, and the shadow in the hallway replayed in my mind like a dark echo. I felt terrible for that woman. I suggested to my colleague that maybe the ghost haunting the morgue was the baby who was still clinging to the world and needed some closure, knowing the anguish she would experience upon discovering the truth. I arranged for the baby's body to be released so the family could take him home as soon as possible. I hoped that by doing this, his soul would finally find rest and no longer linger around that eerie metal cradle. He nodded solemnly, not disputing my theory. In our line of work, we tend to hold on to rational explanations, but what we had experienced surpassed all reason. For the remainder of that day, I refrained from going back to the morgue because I believed that my job was to simply let the mother and her child have one final bond, even if it was on different planes, by not interfering with whatever process was going on. I later learned that the mother had recovered enough to be conscious for a quick farewell. I didn't want to know the specifics of that moment because I needed to move past what had happened that night. However, there were still rumors circulating in the nurses' stations that the mother had sobbed uncontrollably and whispered words that sounded like a prayer or a plea when she saw her child. After that, there was allegedly a thick silence that was so chilling that it made the nurse's blood run cold. The mother then appeared to calm down, closing her eyes in a sort of resigned relief. There was a noticeable sense of calm when the baby's body eventually left the hospital, as if a dark veil had been lifted. The days that followed were difficult, and my colleague and I refrained from telling anyone else about it out of fear of being mocked. But the dark circles under our eyes showed how little sleep we had. Every time I tried to sleep, I would remember the cradle swaying and the sound of a baby crying when it shouldn't have happened, and I would wake up in a cold sweat, visualizing the shadow floating through the morgue corridors. I even thought about quitting the profession or getting psychological help to process that night, but routine took over and the incident became just another terrifying tale in my mind. Even now, on calm evenings when the darkness is deep and the quiet is deafening, I believe I can hear a faint SOB echoing through the hall, a reminder of that fateful night that I will probably never be able to forget. I've thought about what happened a lot. Perhaps that cry was some leftover energy, an echo of a bond broken between a mother and her child who never breathed. Or perhaps it was a natural occurrence that my weary mind transformed into something supernatural. This hospital, with its lengthy history and walls saturated by so many experiences, seems to store echoes of pain and suffering. However, no matter how many times I review it, I am unable to come up with a workable explanation for the loud bang on the chamber door or the very real physical movements that my colleague and I saw. Every time I deal with a stillborn case where nagging anxiety returns, I always suggest that if the mother is conscious and willing, she be given time for a proper goodbye, because I believe it's crucial to ensure nothing remains trapped clinging to a sort of limbo. I've had to accept that in a place like this, where the line between life and death is so thin, doors may open to events our minds aren't equipped to grasp. Although not all of my coworkers hold these beliefs, I cannot ignore the evening that permanently altered my viewpoint. I've tried to describe everything in detail, not to convince anyone, but to let go of the tension and find some purpose that eases my anxieties. If someone asks me if I believe in forces beyond our comprehension, I tell them that I know there are things that defy logic, and that, despite the fact that my work is closely related to science, it doesn't protect me from the unknown. There are nights when I can still see the cradle swaying on its own, reflecting the dim light of the emergency lamps, and hear that desperate SOB that seems to pierce flesh and bone. Without hesitation, I respond that death isn't always a clear-cut, definitive ending. Sometimes, in a setting as full of suffering and hope as a hospital, loose threads remain, unmet longings and unfinished loves, and those threads can take shape in ways that shake you to your core. Ever since, every overnight shift in the morgue has left me feeling queasy, and my eyes wander through the dim hallways and my ears. I continue to perform my duties, but I'm still terrified of reliving such an experience. I'm attentive to every groan of the pipes. My greatest fear is that, in the cold reality of the world, some tragic stories never really end. I know myself well enough to know that, should it ever happen again, I would probably react the same way that horror paralyzes you, no matter how many years of experience you have. Worse yet is the idea that, despite our best efforts to step back or rationalize, there are times when souls cannot find rest and they pull us right into the heart of their despair.